Generally, internment is the confinement of large groups in a detention camp without trial. This camp is primarily created to hold enemy aliens or other political opponents. This is different from imprisonment, as those who have been imprisoned into a camp are there because they have committed some sort of crime. But in the 1940s, Japanese Canadians had committed no such thing. But as a result of the xenophobic views against them, they were forced to be put through turmoil and hardships. Japanese immigration to Canada began in 1877 with the arrival of a 19-year-old sailor named Manzo Nagano. Although it is unconfirmed, he is considered to be the first known Japanese immigrant to settle in Canada. By 1914, Manzo would be accompanied by many more Japanese people as their collective population gradually increased to almost 18,000. Predominantly, most of these settlers were young, single males from economically depressed villages in Japan who had traveled to Canada in hopes of starting a new life. At the beginning of the 20th century, when their population upsurged, these inhabitants resided and were highly concentrated in British Columbia. In fact, 95% of them were living in this province. They were encouraged and persuaded to move here because Japanese laborers could effortlessly attain jobs in fishing, mining, and lumbering industries. Eventually, they had become acclimatized to British Columbia and collectively formed small communities throughout the province. Ultimately, the Japanese, whose population was constantly growing, were becoming prominent members of society. During this era, racism was a widely accepted response to the unfamiliar, which had proven to be especially true for Asians. They were often portrayed as threats to the province's ethnic purity and to the economic security of white Canadians. Also, they were believed to be undesirable for permanent settlement in the country. To this end, a strident anti-Asian element in British Columbia did its best to force the Japanese Canadians to leave Canada. Anti-Asian sentiments reached a high point in 1907 when a mob of anti-Asian demonstrators swept through, rioted, and destroyed nearby Japanese areas. The riot took Vancouver police over 4 hours to control and caused thousands of dollars worth of damage to Japanese homes, boats, and shops. Furthermore, the prejudices were also institutionalized into law. Asians were denied the right to vote, were excluded from most professions, the civil service and the teaching, and were paid much less than their white counterparts. In addition, during the next 4 decades, BC politicians, with the exception of the CCF, catered to the white supremacists of the province and fueled the flames of racism to win elections. In the 1920s, the federal government tried to exclude Japanese Canadians from their traditional livelihood of fishing by limiting the number of fishing licenses. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, the BC government denied them logging licenses and paid Japanese Canadians only a fraction of the social assistance paid to whites. Ultimately, to counteract the negative impacts of white Canadians, the law, and the government, the Japanese, like many other minorities, were forced to live in ghettos and develop their own institutions, like schools and hospitals. This is an image of a Japanese store on Powell Street, which was a major Japanese ghetto, and is a sample of the damage the white supremacists had inflicted in the 1907 riot. This image illustrates the depth of their hatred that Canadians held at the time. Regarding World War II, the event which triggered Japanese War and eventually the internment of Japanese in the US and Canada occurred on December 7, 1941. This event was a surprise attack on the US naval base called Pearl Harbor in Hawaii by Japanese Air Force. America suffered heavy casualties as a result of this bombing. 2,400 were killed, 1,100 were wounded, and many military war machines had been either destroyed or damaged. The events then after were as follows. The Empire of Japan declared war on the US and British Empire, and the US declared war on the Empire of Japan. Now Canada had come into the equation as it was part of the Allies, and Japan was part of their enemy, the Axis. At the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, There were about 23,000 people of Japanese descent who made their home in Canada, or principally in British Columbia. After war had been declared on Japan in December of 1941, fears that Japanese Canadians working near the coastline were charting the seas for Japanese Navy and therefore were spies to the Canadian military. Americans and Canadians alike felt that Japanese Canadians were traitors. This is a political cartoon which shows their fear. Citizens thought that Japanese living in North America would make a fifth column, which is a group within a country secretly aiding an enemy attack from outside. As a result of this, public in BC had become extremely racist and felt that anything bad, such as a failed crop or flat tire, was the fault of the Japanese. Citizens in BC built huge hatred for them. As can be seen in this picture, there is a sign in front of a shop which states that Japanese Canadians aren't welcome here. This signifies the extreme hatred people had for Japanese Canadians in the 1940s. This resulted in a huge outcry by provincial and municipal representatives, as well as influential newspapers, to rid British Columbia of the menacing Japanese Canadians. Ian Mackenzie, an MP in Canada, had said, "It is the government's plan to get these people out of BC as fast as possible. It is my personal intention, as long as I remain in public life, to see that they never come back here. Let our slogan be for British Columbia, no Japs from Rockies to the seas." The Prime Minister of Canada, Mackenzie King, wanted votes from BC and therefore was more than happy to give the BC residents what they wanted. King introduced the War Measures Act on February 24, 1942, giving the federal government power to intern all people of Japanese origin. Posters like these were issued throughout British Columbia. Japanese Canadians had been prohibited to many areas and were given daytime curfews. A great feeling of isolation had come over them. They were to be placed in segregated camps. Innocent Japanese Canadians were now stripped of their rights, issued special clothing, humiliated, thrown behind barbed wire fences, and were forced to do manual labor.